Charged Up Episode 15, all about your 401k.
Are you ready to get charged up about your money, your credit, and your overall financial health? You've come to the right place. You're listening to Charged Up with Jenny Hoff.
Welcome to Charged Up. I'm your host, Jenny Hoff, and a managing editor at CreditCards.com, where we have credit and debt experts who work hard to help people take control of their financial situations. Perhaps one of the most important areas of your personal finance strategy is planning for retirement. The most popular retirement savings plan outside of Social Security, which we know doesn't really pay the bills, is a 401k. Now, 90 million Americans participate in a 401k as well as a 403b, but do we really know what it's all about? And what are the options for people who don't have an employer if they want to take advantage of deferring taxes and stashing money away for later in life? My guest today is Tom Zgainer, CEO and founder of America's Best 401k. Now, if you listen to this podcast normally, the company should sound familiar, as Tony Robbins, who is also a partner in the company, talked about it in a recent interview we did for this show. Tom founded America's Best 401k after working for years in the corporate retirement services sector and seeing too many people paying way too much in fees, seemingly small percentages that when compounded make a huge difference in what people have in their accounts when they retire. Today, he'll talk about that as well as the basics of your 401k and 403b, what to do if you leave your job, whether you should ever tap into that money, and how to maximize what you can save, whether you're an employer, employed, or living off side gigs. Let's get charged up about your 401k. Tom, thanks so much for joining us today.
My pleasure, Jenny. It's so great to be here with you today.
So let's start with the basics of a 401k and 403b, because I think a lot of people are confused about really how these work. What are these two types of retirement savings vehicles, and why do we need to be utilizing them? Additionally, who would be utilizing each one?
Each are considered employer-sponsored retirement plans. And here's really where that gets important right from the get-go. Statistics show that Americans that do not have access to a company-sponsored retirement plan have less than $1,000 saved for retirement. Think about it. You get to your active work life is completed. Now you have to live off the savings you've accumulated, and most Americans have less than $1,000. By comparison, those that are offered a plan through their employer and take advantage of them are going to be in much better self to sustain themselves. So when you think about the two plans, a 403b, most of those historically are in the educational market, universities, schools, school districts, high schools, things of that nature. A lot of teachers have 403b plans. You also see them in hospitals, medical centers, and some government plans, maybe a fire department, for example. And that's what those types of entities used to have solely. But then a few years ago, those types of entities could also have a 401k plan. The primary uniqueness to both is that it gives a participant, an employee, the ability to defer, say, up to $18,000 a year from their own pay. Okay? This is all good to have the savings vehicle at hand. The problem, though, is oftentimes the providers chosen are taking those savings from Billy or Sally, putting their hard-earned money out of their paycheck each week, and more of their savings are going to pay third parties and providers than actually working for them over time. So while it's great to have an employer-sponsored retirement plan, it also pays, as we'll talk further during our discussion today, of the type of plan you have and who they're with and the investments within, because it might not be doing you a heck of a lot of good even putting money into those plans.
Okay, wow, interesting. So is there a big difference between a 403b and a 401k, or is it, like you said, it's just really what industry you're working in?
Yeah, it's more the industry as opposed to the differences, because both allow employer contributions, both allow participants to take money out of their own pay. It's just going to be a matter then of where those dollars are being invested for the most part.
And take money out of your pay means you get to defer taxes. You don't pay taxes on that initial money that's going into that 401k or 403b.
Well, it'll depend. Like a lot of 401k plans now, most do have both a pre-tax option and a Roth option. So if, for example, if I have $1,000 taken out of my pay this month, if I have it taken out on a pre-tax basis and I make $5,000 a month, I'm only taxed today on $4,000. My federal and state tax liability is deferred until age 59 and a half when I take those monies out. However, in the Roth option, if I make that same $5,000 a month and put $1,000 into my 401k, I'm still taxed on $5,000 today. What does that mean over time? Well, when I look at my balance at age 60 and I see $1 million in my account, if it's pre-tax, it's not really $1 million, probably 35% less because now I have to pay federal and state taxes. But if I've been putting money in all along the way in a Roth 401k, that $1 million is my $1 million because the taxes were already taken care of. And there's not really a right or wrong per se. It's how you think tax rates might go up or down, or if you want to reduce your tax liability at retirement.
Are you taxed on also the interest that you accumulate with your 401k, or do you just pay tax on the principal, the money that you actually put into it?
Yeah, so in the Roth, same way, your growth of your assets over time are not going to have any taxation. Whereas in the pre-tax version, that balance that is accumulated includes also the growth of your deferrals and would be subject to taxation.
I mean, it almost makes no sense to not do the Roth.
Well, you'd be surprised. Like, we have a lot of folks that they'll kind of hedge their bets. They'll put $9,000 in a pre-tax and $9,000 in Roth. Why would somebody do that? Some people might think tax rates are going to go down. And so therefore, if you defer your taxes, now 20 years from now, you take your monies out, you would have paid less money. The fact is, no one is Nostradamus here. We don't really know what's going to go on. So oftentimes, if you're on the younger age and you're essentially in a lower tax bracket now, take advantage of that Roth to get the taxes out of the way. It's really a personal opinion, not a right or wrong kind of an answer.
So now I want to talk a little bit about, you mentioned overpaying for funds. So Tony Robbins, who we interviewed on Charged Up a couple of weeks ago, he's a partner in your company, America's Best 401k. He said people who have a 401k, which is about 90 million Americans, and a 403b are overpaying for their funds. Can you go into that more? What does overpaying mean? How much should the fees be? And what is the difference if we're paying an extra percent?
Yeah, this is a fascinating topic, and it all goes to if you're a participant in a 401k plan or a 403b plan, you are restricted to using the providers and the investment options chosen by your well-intentioned employer. And I emphasize well-intentioned because they think they're putting together a good benefit for themselves and their employees. But then it really depends upon what provider did they choose. Because if, for example, they're using a 401k plan that maybe is through an insurance company with brokers and that also pay providers, there's going to be a certain type of funds that are listed in the investment options. They're generally called actively managed funds. As a result, those types of funds will often have expense ratios, the annual cost of buying the fund, well north exceeding 1.5% to 2%. Why is that? Well, it's because embedded inside that fund cost, multiple people are getting paid, little slices of it. So you might think you're putting $100 away from your paycheck, but there's parts that are getting parceled out to third parties that do nothing in exchange. They're not providing any value in exchange to justify it. So alternatively, you can use a lineup like we do where you're going to use index funds. In the case of, say, Vanguard, for example, where there are more retirement plan assets using Vanguard funds than any other fund company in the world. What's different there? Well, now the expense ratios of those funds are about 0.12%, just over 0.1%. How can that be? They don't have those other embedded fees to pay third parties. It's stripped of all those fees. And so our well-intentioned employer partners maybe with a national payroll company as a matter of convenience, integration with payroll, or they know Joe the broker down the street from Rotary Club or school or the Little League field or whatever it might be, and Joe's a good guy, so he sends you to this insurance company solution, right? But you don't know that the fees embedded in that plan are essentially robbing your retirement savings over time. It is astonishing what we see day to day, Jenny. We're on average, we are reducing investment fees 57% for folks that had no idea that their retirement savings even needed rescued. They didn't know they needed a lifeline. They didn't even know they were out for a boat ride, right? And then we show them the effective fees going forward out 20 years, and it becomes astonishing. And they almost get very emotional at this point in time because they're like, I thought I was doing something good for my employees. So it's not that the 401k is a bad thing. It's the choice of providers that could be devastating for somebody's future. future.
And so if you're an employee and you get your statement and it's filled with all of these lines of different investments that your 401k has, how do you read it to kind of know if you're in a good place? For instance, does Vanguard need to basically be on there someplace you know that at least some of it's going to an index fund? Or how can you read it if you're not a financial expert?
Yeah, this is why we want people to come to us, and we actually created an ancillary website called itsyourmoney.com that is to help participants in this exact case, Jenny, and here's why. Before 2012, the financial services industry never had to tell you what they were charging you. Think of it. This is our largest investment outside of home ownership, participation in a company-sponsored retirement plan. As you mentioned earlier, close to 90 million Americans are doing so, right? This is the money we need to sustain ourselves 20, 30 years after we work. And yet we have no idea how fees are affecting us. So in 2012, after 30 plus years, new requirements came out where providers are now required to provide a disclosure to both the employer and to all participants. But here's the problem with those. Yes, they're complying with the rules and the laws, but these documents are 20 to 50 pages long. And there is numbers all over the place. And then you have to say, well, how is this number on page 11 relative to the numbers on page 35? Because one thing can change the complete complexion on the other. Okay? And so this is where we come in, because that document essentially becomes the optics for us to provide a diagnosis. And so we have encouraged participants to send us their fee disclosures, because if we can see in a side-by-side comparison that not only could they potentially improve the plan overall, I suggest they look like a hero to their employer. Why? Because their employer often has the largest balance in the plan and therefore the most to lose. So if they send us their disclosure and we do a side-by-side comparison and they can see that they can reduce their fees 50 to 70%, and over 20 years it puts $2 to $5 million back into the pockets of all the participants in the plan, that is something to celebrate. That's a joyful event to take to your employer to say, I was doing some digging around over here and look what I found. And so now we have hundreds of participants every single month sending us our disclosures so we can try to get to the reasons why there might be opportunities for improvement.
All right. Fantastic. So it's something that we should pay attention to. And so you guys have a website, Show Me the Money, right?
It's your money. It's your money.
It's your money.
Key phrase there, Jenny. It's your money, right? We want people to say, this is your money. Don't accept that the math that's occurring has to be that way. It can change.
All right. Itsyourmoney.com. You can plug in the numbers or send over that disclosure so you can see exactly what you are paying in fees and what you could be paying in fees. And that difference, just that knowledge can change your life, probably.
It is literally life-saving, because think about yourself at age 65 and having less than $1,000 saved for retirement. How does life look at that point, right? It is filled with concern and worry. And this is why we're having to go out and work somewhere at age 70, because we didn't pay attention to what we were doing during our years of accumulating income, be it as an employer or an employee. It doesn't matter. But in those working years, if the accumulation of your income was not also building your security bucket that will sustain yourselves, boy, you're in a troublesome spot at that point.
Yeah, absolutely. So what do you do if you're in a corporation, a huge corporation, and nobody's listening to you? You say we're paying too much in fees. Is there anything you can do individually to take care of the fees that you're at least paying, or are you just stuck with the plan that you're given?
Yeah, this goes back to the comment earlier where if you are an employee and your employer offers a 401k plan, whether you're at a small company, medium, or large, you are stuck for your 401k to using that 401k plan unless you have side income where you can set up an individual 401k plan that could be really great for you. But that's not most people, right? These 90 million Americans we're talking about, they are expecting or believing that their employer-sponsored plan is great. And so you're kind of stuck. You could go out and pivot out and get an individual retirement account, and now you can put away $5,500 a year. That's better. If your 401k plan is so horrible, maybe that's a consideration, right? Ideally, though, is you should try to have a voice and share this with ownership and management. And granted, the very largest corporations in America, Jenny, should have and often do have a great plan. But, if you pose a question to say, what about small companies, right? Well, the financial services industry does clearly make a distinction that size matters. If you said, hey, Tom, I want to start up a 401k plan today. I've got 5 employees. You are most certainly going to be rejected or treated differently by many providers. They don't see any money in it for them, so they don't want to serve you, right? Or they will manufacture additional asset-based fees on top of the expense ratios to make sure they line their pockets first at your expense. The model that I created in 2012 with America's Best 401k was to say that is just BS that has been fed to people for 30 years. Because on any given street, if we were to have a barbecue today, invariably somebody would be paying 10 to 15 times more in their 401k purely because of the size of their company. I set out to change that and said, that is wrong. Every company, no matter the size, should have access to the same low-cost investments as any massively large corporation. It's a 401k plan, for crying out loud. There's nothing you need to qualify for, right? It's their money, and we keep focusing on it's their money, not ours. And so that's where you can create a new way of doing it. The financial services industry just cares not to do so.
So can you quickly tell us what is the difference for the average person that may be like, okay, so 0.65 versus 1.5, that's not that big of a difference, but it is. So can you quickly illustrate how big of a difference that is when it goes down to when you're retiring?
If we had 3 people and we have Angelica who has 1% in fees, and we have Armand who has 2% in fees, and we have Aaron who has 3% in fees, and they each put away money over the course of their 30 years of their work life, these round figures, then the people who have 1% difference in fees are essentially going to lose 10 years off their retirement savings. So the difference between 1 and 2% over the course of your work life could be 10 years of retirement savings lost needlessly to fees over time. It is the small numbers that are massively critical for us to understand. Where I mentioned at the top, where 70% of participants in 401k plans don't believe that there are any investment fees. If you don't even know that there are fees, my goodness, you sure don't know the effect of them. And so when we put that on paper, it does have a truly visceral reaction amongst people who get truly emotional saying, how could that be? That number seemed so small. But over time, with compounding, negative or positive, it could be devastating to your future.
Wow. Okay. Let's talk about self-employed individuals. You mentioned you can do, if you had a side job, you can do another type of 401k. Can you talk about your options? There's a lot of freelancers now. There's a lot of people trying to kind of do their own gigs and not be full-time with any company, so they don't have that 401k matching perk. What can they do to defer as much money that they're making as possible and get that into a retirement plan?
You can get what's called an individual 401k plan that essentially mirrors the same options and opportunities that a corporately sponsored one, meaning you could have a Roth option, you could have a Pretax option, you can still put away $18,000. So let's just say, for example, that I had an employer and they had an okay 401k plan, not that great, but they did give me maybe a match, right? Let's say a 3% match of the first 5% I put away. And let's say that equals to be $10,000 or $5,000, whatever it is, right? So I defer as much as I can to ensure I get the match from my employer. Well, let's say my 401k deferrals added up to be $8,000. Well, if you've got a side gig like you mentioned, you still have another $10,000 because the limit is 18, right? You did 8 over at your employer. You still could put another $10,000 into an individual 401k. And then maybe even more dollars that are considered profit sharing amounts. And so it's very worthwhile, especially because a lot of our workplace has gone non-traditional, 1099, a lot of freelancers. For example, Vanguard has a product called the Solo K. It doesn't cost anything to set up, uses the same low-cost investments we use in our 401k plans, but it gives the ability to have people start socking money away on their own. I would absolutely recommend anybody that has just self-employment income to establish an individual 401k, for sure.
And is the Solo K also tax deferred, or is that after tax?
It could be either. You can still put your monies away pre-tax or after tax.
Great to know. So actually, if you have kind of a bad 401k plan at your work and you can't do anything to change it, you could just put enough in to get your employer's matching funds, because obviously you want their money too, and then take the rest and put it into an individual account if you have a side gig, correct?
And hopefully in your employer, there's at least a couple of good funds in there, some low-cost index funds to minimize your expense. Yes, that would be an effective strategy.
Okay, great. Let's talk a little bit more about the 403B, just because I've gotten several emails from listeners about that. They work in those industries that you mentioned. So who qualifies for this? I think we've answered people who work in those industries. How's it different from a 401k and an IRA? And if someone leaves their job, what happens to the money in the 403B and also the 401k?
In the 403B market, let's just focus on teachers, for example. Most teachers have a 403B plan. Our country needs to reward our teachers for getting our youth onto a path, be it in elementary school, middle school, high school, university, whatever it is. And yet, most of the 403Bs we see have actually more egregious fees. There was an article recently, I believe, in the New York Times that talked about a lot of 403B plans have 2 to 5% loads on top of the fund costs. And here's what that means. So not only does a fund cost have an expense ratio of, say, 1.5%, but every time you put money into it each pay period, there's a 2 to 5% services charge. Now, that's just darn wacky that it's even allowed to exist, right? Because there's no value in exchange for that. It's your money out of your own pay, and they're charging you 2 to 5%. And this market has historically been dominated by a few industry providers that this is the style of business. And unfortunately, the teachers are not cognizant about that their savings from, and especially you think about a teacher who in a lot of cases are now having to buy supplies out of their own pocket. They're buying pencils and papers, right? And they're trying to sock money away for their future, and yet they don't know this devastating effect over time. So we're going to see a shift, hopefully, in the next few years where school districts, universities, hospitals, things of that nature will get away from these 403Bs and move to a better 403B or 401k to really cut down these expenses, because it's really, really devastating. To your other question about what happens when you leave, right? Well, there's certain rule sets dictated by your balance size. For example, if you leave an employer and your balance is over $5,000, you could leave that money in that plan as long as you want. By law, you're not required to take it out. Typically, though, because we have billions of dollars being lost, meaning people go from one employer to another, and they forget to take distributions or rollovers from their prior employers. So they forget about it. People actually forget where their money is, right? Think about it. Your savings, and you forget where it is. So the more logical thing to do is, if you leave an employer, would be to roll that money over to an IRA, or if you're going to go directly into another employer's plan, thinking of rolling the money over into the new plan, ostensibly because it's good, right? So hopefully the education we're all getting through your podcast today will have people pause and say, well, before I take that action, let's make sure I'm actually sending it to a good place.
So let's talk about the difference, because we've mentioned now IRA a couple of times and Roth. And for people that are a little bit confused about what is the difference between all of these different retirement vehicles, can we talk about the difference between a Roth versus a traditional IRA versus a 401k?
So individual retirement accounts are typically going to be for folks who either have a 401k at their work and still want to put more monies in, $5,500 is the annual limit, for example, or they have no retirement plan at work and they want to at least save something for their retirement, okay? So they're sort of adjunct to each other. So 401k, 403b are employer-sponsored. An individual retirement account is something you went out and did on your own. So the monies are in different places. They can both have Pretax options. They can both have Roth options. It's just a matter of what your personal preference is. But they are two distinct retirement buckets, so to speak. And certainly, if you have the ability to fill up both, that's going to allow you to start accumulating even more savings for retirement.
Right. So they're all tax deferred in some way. So you either don't pay taxes with a Roth at the end, or you don't pay taxes up front. But if you want to save as much money from taxes as possible, you fill up those buckets.
Absolutely. And if you go the Roth, then just know that as your money starts to grow, that's really your money. If you put monies away in a pre-tax scenario, beginning at age 59 and a half, when you can start to to take distributions, whatever your balance is accumulated to is going to be affected by federal and state taxes at that point.
Okay. All right. So how about using 401k money early or IRA money early? What is the penalty? What expenses are allowed with lower penalties? Can you have that flexibility? Is there a time limit to when you have to leave it in there before you can utilize the principal that you put in?
Yeah, the key age is age 59 and a half. If you take a distribution earlier than that, you'll be subjected to a 20% federal tax hit and a 10% penalty. So you really want to think about, is that your best source to withdraw? Now, granted, there are times when we have emergencies in life, right? And if you really needed to do something, and if you said, okay, I'm willing to take a 30% hit of this because this is incredibly important to my family, well, you have to be sensitive to someone's emotions at that point in time. Is it a good financial decision? Probably not. But if it helps them move on to deal with the scenario that's come up, and hopefully they have more years to work to try to recoup it, okay. But as a general rule, we really should look at this as your security bucket, that I'm not going to touch these dollars. This is why the advice out there, the old adage, is to build a rainy day account, a liquid account, right, in some bank or save. Granted, in a bank or a savings account or CD, maybe it doesn't grow so much interest. But if it does allow you to access it without penalty, then there's certainly logic in doing that. And that's where we have to really part and parcel our savings. This one is one I'm not going to touch until I'm stop working. This one is kind of an emergency fund. If, God forbid, something happened, I can tap into it. I have access to it easily, and I'm not hit on penalties or taxation.
And let's talk about, again, the max that we can contribute to a 401k and a 403b. You've mentioned $18,000. How do we set up our plan? What if you want to max it out, but then you get a bonus later on in the year? Is there a penalty if you accidentally contribute too much, or how does that work?
The payroll system and the 401k platform should not allow you to put in more than that amount. So let's say, for example, heading into this pay period, I've put away $17,000 in my 401k. And out of my pay, my bonus that you just mentioned, I say I want to have $1,500 go to my 401k. Well, there should be a reject at that point in time for $500, right? Because you were at 17, you try to put in $1,500, you can only go to $18,000. Most providers have systems in place that should not allow that to occur. Now, again, to reiterate, we mentioned earlier, if you're over age 50, you can still do another $6,000. It's called a catch-up provision.
All right. And so I think I know what your answer is going to be to this, but what is the most important thing to know about 401ks, and what can we do immediately to take control of our situation right now?
It's your money, and so you need to know the cost of things. When it comes to our money, nothing is more important than knowing how much we have and where it is. And if where it is being invested, what are the costs of my expenses? What are the costs of those investments? So my first suggestion would be, is anybody in a 401k or an IRA or any type of retirement account, go to the website where you manage your plan, or to your HR or benefits department or the provider, and ask them for a disclosure of the exact cost of your investment. Because it's oftentimes not just the expense ratio of the funds themselves. We see many providers, certainly insurance company platforms, they may tack on a 1 or 1.5% fee on top of the expense ratios. So think about it. What if your expense ratio is 1.5 and they add another 1.5% on top? That's 3%. Unless you know that's occurring, you'll never know why your balance isn't really growing. You've got this big boulder that's trying to get pushed uphill because expenses are knocking down your returns. So you have to know the cost of your expenses. And if somebody has their disclosure, simply by sending it over to info@americasbest401k.com, we will dig into that document for them and see if we can't build a storyboard that they might want to share with their employer to consider other ways of doing this for the good of everybody else. But you've got to know what your fees are. You have to.
All right. And actually, I wanted to get one different question in there real quickly that I wanted to ask earlier. And that is, when you are given your 401k options and it's how risky do you want to be, and you fill out a profile, and how do you make that decision? How do you know what's the appropriate decision for you?
We have a questionnaire, 6 questions that do not take a lot of deliberation, but give you a feeling for the type of investor you are today. Maybe aggressive, conservative, moderate, somewhere in between. A lot of it is dictated by your age. A lot of it is dictated by all the things that are going on in the periphery of your financial life. But then once you know what risk profile you fit, That's where, in our case, our advisory team steps in and helps you build a diversified asset allocation strategy that fits that profile. And that's important because you might say, I'm a conservative investor. You might think that you're conservative by nature as a person, right? But if you're 25 and you're going to still work for 30 more years, then being maybe more of an aggressive investor is to your benefit because you have many years to weather the ups and downs in the market and you're looking for growth. But if perhaps I'm 58 and I'm going to retire in a couple of years, well, now I'm going to be more conservative because I want to hold on to what I've built. I don't want it to be exposed to the ups and downs of the markets. So that's where it's important that hopefully that your provider, that your employer has chosen, is giving you resources to help you get to that conclusion, because we're just too much of, I want to have it real fast right now, people nowadays, and we maybe not want to figure out this ourselves, but you darn better well, because again, it's your money.
All right. And finally, Tom, what gets you charged up about retirement planning and helping people save money while reaching their retirement goals?
I have to tell you, Jenny, this is the greatest joy of my business career since the company was founded in 2012, that we're in a position to rescue the retirement savings of Americans. As I mentioned, close to 90 million Americans are putting money away in their 401k plans. Certainly, truly, 90% of those plans are just devastating their savings over time due to needless and excessive fees. And so these are people we will never meet personally. We will never meet their families. But to know that when somebody makes this simple switch of reducing their fees 50 to 70%, and then that company gets to celebrate that with their employees and show them how this math will now change their outlook at retirement. Even though we never meet them individually, we know of them that they're now a client, and there is wonderful joy across our organization knowing that we could have just given somebody a more secured and dignified retirement.
All right. Fantastic. Tom, thank you so much. We learned a lot about 401ks and 403bs today, and we need to know that because this is our primary retirement vehicle for most of us. So thank you so much.
My pleasure, Jenny. Great to be with you.
And thank you for joining me for this episode of Charged Up. I'd love it if you could rate and review us on iTunes and subscribe so you're alerted as soon as a new episode is up. If you have questions you want me to answer on air, please send an email to chargedup@CreditCards.com. To read the full transcript for each episode and access even more great financial information, head on over to CreditCards.com. Until next time, get charged up about your financial future.